everyone, and welcome to episode 185 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Symbolism, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. In the Middle Ages, swans could be found everywhere, from ponds, lakes, and moats to shields, tombs, and stories. Delicious and expensive, swans were used to make everything from arrows to flutes. Through their association with one of medieval Europe's favorite literary figures, as well as one of its favorite crusader kings, these beautiful birds have made a lasting impact on Western culture in wide-ranging and unexpected ways. This week, I spoke with Dr. Natalie Goodison about the medieval swan. Natalie is a teaching fellow at Durham University and the co-author of On the Fringes, Outsiders and Otherness in the Medieval and Early Modern World, along with Alexander J. Wilson. She also contributed to the work done on a medieval birth girdle, which you may remember from my podcast episode about that work with Sarah Fiddyment last year. Natalie's most recent book is the latest in the University of Wales' series on medieval animals, Introducing the Medieval Swan. Our conversation about swans, their famous death songs, why they were such a popular symbol among medieval royalty, and what this all has to do with Walt Disney is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Natalie, for joining me to talk about medieval swans. It's so nice to meet you.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So this is definitely the most elegant animal we've talked about on the podcast, because we've talked about pigs and we've talked about the medieval ass. And actually, your book is the next in the series, Introducing. So let's talk about swans. First of all, when I was talking with Jamie Kreiner about pigs, she mentioned that the pigs that medieval people would be exposed to didn't look like the pigs of today. Do swans look like they did back in the Middle Ages today? So we would see a swan and recognize it right away?
As far as we know, yes. In my book, I have lots of fun images. I really wanted it to have lots of pictures because I thought the swans were so beautiful and so different. And the swans that I found kind of in the bestiary manuscripts in the British Library, I can recognize it as a swan, and I think most people would as well. So the most common swan we find is the mute swan. And of course, it has the kind of elegant S-shaped neck. And as we see today with the mute swan, they have black feet and then a really red bill. But there are also two other swans that are common to medieval Europe, and some of those are shared with North America, but not all of them. The one is the whooper swan, and it is about the same size as the mute swan, but instead of the elegant S-shaped neck, it has kind of an upright neck, and it has a yellow and black, bill. That's a bit straighter. And then you also have something called Buick swans, and they're smaller, but they look a lot like the whooper swan, so they're just a kind of a tinier version. But the whooper and Buick swans are tundra swans, so they're the kind of Arctic swans. So they kind of live in the upper regions and they nest there, and then they often fly and nest in the winter time. In Northern Europe, so, Scotland, Iceland, if you think about the borders of Germany, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, along there. But you also get tundra swans in North America as well. But they're called whistling swans. They tend to be called whistling swans, and I think are just slightly different genetically.
So we have a few different types, but the most common type in medieval Europe, you're saying, is the mute swan, which is kind of ironic because one of the first places we start hearing about swans in antiquity, for example, is talking about their songs. So can you tell us about the swan song?
Yeah, so that was one of the most ironic, as you said, things that I was reading. So I was reading all these kind of sources that everyone's saying the swan sings best before it dies. And I think that has very long legs in antiquity in classical thought. And if you were to ask me, where do you think that comes from? I think it would come from the death of Socrates, actually. Plato kind of tells us about how Socrates is dying and he's kind of very dramatically being executed by the state, and all of his followers are very sad. But Socrates, at least according to the Phaedo, isn't afraid to die. And he says, if you don't mind, I'll read a little bit of Socrates. He goes, "And you seem to think," this is Socrates speaking, "I am inferior in prophetic power to the swans, who sing at other times also. When they feel that they are to die, sing most and best, and their joy that they are about to go to the God whose servants they are. And I believe I have that prophetic vision, and that I myself am a fellow servant of the swans, and am consecrated to the same God, and have received from our master a gift of prophecy no whit inferior to theirs." So that's a very long-winded way of saying that Socrates was very grateful to die, and he was emulating the swans because the swans were thought to sing right before they died, according to the Phaedo. And they were very eager, they were happy, they were anticipating to kind of go off into the afterlife because they would get to join Apollo. And Apollo was thought to be the swan, like associated with the swans. And so Socrates basically saying, hey, I'm going to die really happily just like them, and I'm going to get to go to see the god who I serve. And of course, the medieval crossover between classical and kind of medieval theological ideas. And somehow, most natural history works, that bit about the swan singing before it dies, best and most beautiful, it gets kind of changed around a motif, but it's the thing that's recurred most often. So when you look in a bestiary, it says the song is most to sing most often at the death. So it has its legs in antiquity.
Yeah. And so it's something that people are trying to sort of shoehorn into the story of the swans, even though you kind of suggest in the book that maybe they are talking about a different breed of swan and not the mute swan, and it gets applied to the mute swan, and how many people are actually there when the swan dies. Maybe it's just something that happens, a tree falling in the forest, right?
Exactly. If we're looking at medieval science, the bestiary is probably the most often rehearsed place where you look at a swan, and it talks about swan singing. But I guess the main source for the bestiary material is probably Isidore of Sevilla. And Isidore of Sevilla, talks about, he actually doesn't talk about swan singing before they die, but he talks about how the swan is most to be known for its song. But he gives this line, which ends up coming also from antiquity, saying that swans are known to sing, and they've been even known to sing to human accompaniment, and they've been known to sing in the northern Hyperborean regions. And it's just a really weird reference. Like, why would that happen? And I just began prodding it a little bit, and it turns out the Hyperborean regions are pretty much the Arctic. And it turns out that the tundra swans, so the whooper swan and Buick swan, have an amazing musicality in their voice. So they not only use it as they're flying or long distances, but they also use it in like their nesting grounds to communicate. And they're known to sing in hundreds of thousands. So like that would be one of the coolest things to witness, I think, as I'm singing. But they're also known to sing in duet, which means that they have the songbird genetic gene. And songbirds are known, if you've had a parakeet, they kind of imitate human sounds, and they can sing along with you, and they can potentially harmonize and duet. And so that's a well-known human speech pathology. So humans and birds share that same kind of ability to sing. So there is the possibility that the idea that Isidore is saying, hey, birds sing to human duet is possibly true. And then that got me thinking, like, oh my gosh, if that's possibly true, what else could possibly be true? I just started pulling it out a little bit, and I think it just depends on how you view natural history. So if we view natural history now, it tends to be really data driven, right? It tends to be like people sitting in fields and saying, this is how many hundred swans are migrating, this is their feeding, this is their breeding habit, this is what they tend to eat. So we observe it and then we write it down. But of course, in the medieval world, that's not the most interesting thing. You do have people who do amazing, like Albertus Magnus does amazing things with natural history, very similar to what we would call kind of natural science. But with the bestiary, the kind of most thing that they're recording is what is the most amazing thing that this animal does. And so, of course, for the swan, it's the fact that it sings, and it sings often kind of as a prophecy before its death. So it sings very beautiful before its death. And if you kind of look at it in one-off instances, there are several attestations to people of eyewitnesses who have seen this happening. You have the genetic capacity for it to happen. It doesn't happen with mute swans, but with whooper swan, they have an extra loop of trachea in their windpipe. And so that means that as it's dying, it exhales this, it has the potential to exhale this really, really long note. And one of the most famous natural scientists of the 19th century, 19th, 20th century, witnessed this happening. And then you have it being genetically possible, witnessing by lots and lots of scholars. So I have about 8 sources who say it all is possible. But I think it's best to look at it in this could be possible in a one-off scenario, rather than if you happen to see a swan dying, you were definitely going to hear it sing, if that makes sense. It just depends on how you want to look at natural history.
Yes. And I think that's a really important point, and something that you make a couple times in the book, that in medieval sources, they're always looking for the most unusual thing instead of what is the most normal thing. And that's something I hadn't thought about in those terms, but it's so true about the way that the bestiaries work, for example. So let's come back to that, because the bestiaries are not meant to just tell you about the natural features of an animal. They're meant to tell you other things as well. So tell us about how the bestiary works, especially in terms of swans.
So bestiaries, all medieval data, so much of medieval data, is a natural tool meant to kind of show us or kind of probe the question of what can these natural things of the world show us about creation and created order and the God who made them, especially about marvelous properties. So what it is kind of imbibing is if you know C.S. Lewis is kind of the discarded image, it's imbibing this kind of image of a medieval universe where you have different spheres and different planets and these natural properties kind of honing into different things at different times, enabling marvelous properties to happen. So that's one aspect of looking at the unusual elements in an animal, because that kind of gives the most glory to God because it's so unusual. But the other way of looking at it is, and this is so often in medieval texts, is it's allegorical. So what you see, the outside, is often reflective of something symbolic, but something that often has an interior correlation. So if you were to look at this animal, what can we learn about ourselves from it? So I don't think I use this word in the book, but I think the swan more or less was thought to be something called like the Pharisee. So it was meant to be something that looked really good and really beautiful on the outside, but it was meant to be hiding. I think the word in some translation is dissimulation, which when I looked up just meant sin. That's the word for sin. That means that it kind of, it's hypocritical. So the outside is very, very pretty, but the inside is different. They also would say that its long neck was symbolic of pride. It's very tall, straight neck. They said that was also feeding into the kind of hypocritical stance. And it took me a long time to figure out why on earth the swan would be considered hypocritical. And I don't know if I've got this right in the end, but the best guess I have is that on the cover of my book, and if you look at like a bestiary image of the swan, you see the swan kind of, I don't even know how to say this. It's kind of like one of those cameras in water where you can see the upper half of the bird and the lower half in the water. So above the water, the swan is like really white and beautiful and looks very pretty. But underneath, the mute swan particularly has black feet. And so it's the kind of whiteness contrasted to blackness. And of course, this has problematic readings if we apply it racially, but if you were to apply it just kind of allegorically and symbolically, of course, in Old Testament theology, white was purity, white was cleansed from sins, while blackness emulated a sinful heart. So it's the idea that something looks really clean on the outside, but underneath actions. So I think that's how they got there with the swan, though I'm not 100% sure on that.
Mm-hmm. I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's funny because as you're talking about this, I'm thinking of a couple of things that we still talk about. For example, the devil having different feet, right? The devil has cloven feet. So you have to look down and you have to see what the feet look like. And that's how you know that this is somebody that is untrustworthy. And I think that you see that too. Yeah. And then the other thing I was thinking of is we still think of swans as being different above the water and below the water, right? We still talk about the swan being so serene, but underneath it's paddling furiously. And that's meant to be something about, you know, looking like things are not phasing you at all. But I think that above the water, below the water is a good theory. And especially when you think about the colors and the allegorical perspective that people have when they're putting these things together. So when we talk about the swan as being a hypocritical figure, is there anything we're supposed to learn from it? If you see a swan, it's supposed to make you think about something.
Well, I think for Chaucer, he would say it would be hypocrisy. So Chaucer, when he's describing it, I think it's the Franklin in the Canterbury Tales, says he's basically fat as a wine bottle in a cellar and waddling like a swan. And of course, the other thing about the mute swan is it looks really beautiful in water, but it has a super awkward gait. It kind of like rocks like the Titanic from side to side. So the idea that, I think it's the Franklin, the idea that he's so fat, you know, he's meant to take these vows of abstinence and kind of being fed by the people. So if he's so fat, he's waddling. It's the idea that that's the definition of hypocrisy. And then possibly pride from its long neck.
I think that makes sense. When it comes to Chaucer and talking about religious figures, I think there's always going to be pride thrown in there as well.
Yes.
So this one becomes, even though it's a symbol of hypocrisy and not always a good symbol in bestiaries, it becomes a real symbol of people that are important, right? So royalty and richness, and it even is a symbol, it becomes a Valkyrie, at least in one story. So as the Middle Ages go on, it becomes a really important and elite symbol. And you think this is traced back to the story of the Swan Knight. So can you tell us about the story of the Swan Knight?
Yes, I can. So probably the earliest complete story of the Swan Knight is from a 12th century text called the Dolopathos. And the Dolopathos tells a story of, I just want to make sure I've got the details right because there's so many different variations. Is a knight finds a lady bathing and she's wearing a golden chain, and he seizes that chain and says we should get married, and she agrees, but she kind of forecasts that she's going to give birth to 7 children. she's called a fae. So a fairy, and she has these kind of prophetic abilities. So they get married and she gives birth to septuplets. So one of my other interests is kind of abnormal birth in the Middle Ages. So that's always really interesting. But these children are not only septuplets, but they're all born with chains around their necks. Now, the Queen Mother doesn't like her new daughter-in-law, and so what we say in medieval literature, she calumniates her, so she kind of falsely accuses her, and she says that she's given birth to dogs. So the son is horrified that the wife has given birth to dogs, which is of course a lie, and imprisons the wife for a very long time. The mother-in-law, Queen Mother, ends up putting the 7 children to a henchman, leaves them to a forest, and tells the henchman to kill them. He can't do that, so he just leaves them to die. But of course, they get rescued by a hermit, a monk, and a deer suckles them to make sure that they're alive. When they come of age, like between 7, maybe 7 years old, a few years later, the children are bathing and a henchman comes and takes off their chains and they turn into swans. And all but one of the children transform. And so it's this little brother who didn't get transformed, goes to court and ends up fighting the Queen Mother's man, ends up killing him, finding the chains, and then returning them to each of his siblings. However, one of the chains was used to try and make a golden goblet, but these chains were magically reinforced, and so they can't actually make it into a goblet. But one little link of the chain is damaged, and because it's the idea that it's damaged, it doesn't have its transformative potential anymore. So this one poor wee swan who's always going to be a swan, and it's very sad. And so in the Dilopothis, it's just very pithy, and it says, and this night, and the swan would accompany his brother, who would become, known far into antiquity as the Swan Knight. So the idea is that one brother couldn't bear to be parted from his sibling, and so they would adventure together. And often you'll see in medieval manuscripts a swan with a golden chain pulling a knight in a boat, and it's the idea that they're, in the French tradition, they're brothers. So they're one brother pulling the other. This idea becomes popularized in a slightly different version in the Crusade cycles. Now, the Crusade cycles are just the early stories about the First Crusade. And the First Crusade was the most successful, right? It's where the West had its kind of 30 seconds of winning back the Holy Land. And the person who won back, or kind of in tradition, the person who won back the Holy Land was the Bouillon family. So you had Eustace of Bouillon, Baldwin of Bouillon, and then of course the very famous Godfrey of Bouillon. So in the early Crusade cycles, not one person gets the credit, but as the stories are kind of accumulating, it's Godfrey of Bouillon who gets the credit. And their 2 brothers, often Eustace and Godfrey, in some of the later stories are talking to each other. And in one version, Eustace is like, "Oh, you fought really well today, Godfrey. You fought like our great ancestor, the Knight of the Swan." So weirdly, all of a sudden, is you have these kind of 2, like a fictional kind of literary tradition being superimposed on a pseudo-historical rendition of the Crusades. But somehow the idea that Godfrey and his brother Eustace were Swan Knight descendants just took off, like it just went nuts. So everyone seemed to really be excited by this. And even one historian says, and I'm not even going to rehearse that Godfrey of Bouillon was related to the Swan Knight, because I think that's a myth, but everyone else is saying it, and I'm a bit, the sense is I'm a bit weary of it being repeated because I think it's a lie. But this kind of idea of mythical ancestry is really cool, because you also get it in the literary tradition of Melusine. Like Melusine is all about founding the Lusignan dynasty. So it's not the only place in medieval literature where this happens, where history and kind of a mythical founder superimpose. Eustace of Bouillon ended up going back. Godfrey ended up dying in the Holy Land, but Eustace ended up going back to his duchy in Bouillon, and he had children and he had descendants. And so his probably most famous descendant was his daughter Matilda, who ended up marrying King Stephen of England. And the 2 of them put the swan into their dynasty. So they even have a book that says, the famous descendant of Matilda is the Swan Knight. That is her lauded ancestor. So this was already kind of in the DNA of, especially English. I particularly focus on English royal ancestry. But it's not only English. So you have it in particularly like German and what is now Dutch and Denmark kind of housing. So you have even Philip the Bold, the Dukes of Burgundy, you have Brabant, and you have lots of House of Cleves, you have lots of different families, especially in the German regions, who are all claiming Swan Knight ancestry. And so how do you announce to everyone that you are a descendant of Godfrey? How do you say that this is your ancestor? And I bet you've already got there, but the most obvious way is you advertise it, right? You put it on your shield, you put it on your coat of arms, you put it on your house, you put it on your helmet. And so all of a sudden throughout Europe, as you get loads and loads of, you would have like castles that have like swan motifs in them. You have tombs that have really beautiful swans on the tombs. And what you're looking for is, if you want to know if it's a swan-like descendant, that's what they're advertising. You're looking for a swan that has we call it ducally gorge, but that's just a fancy word for saying it looks like it has a crown around its neck, and it often is attached to a chain. So if you're in a museum or maybe Exeter Cathedral, which has several, that's what you're looking for. So I actually found one weirdly in a pub in Cornwall one day. I was looking up and I was like, oh my goodness, the swans from Ducally Gorge. So they were trumpeting swan-like ancestry from, long ages past. That's kind of how we get it to be such a popular symbol of household names and on coats of arms and in books and on tombs and in households.
Yeah, it's so surprising. I had always seen this Ducally Gorge, this crowned swan before, and wonder like, why is it chained like that? Why is it important that it's chained like that? And now we know it's back to the story of the Swan Knight. And so these symbols, this idea of the swan being everywhere, it actually caused some trouble in the reign of Richard II. So can you tell us about that? Because I think this is one of the moments where the symbol of the swan gets pretty intense.
Yes. One of my arguments for the book is that it does become really contentious in the age of Richard II. My husband in my book said it would have been really helpful if you could have listed the English kings. And I'm like, you're English, like this is your history, because I don't know them. So Richard II ended up being king at a very young age, and he ended up being ruled by his uncles. His two most famous uncles were John of Gaunt and Thomas of Woodstock. Now, Thomas of Woodstock ended up marrying into what we call a De Boon family. And the De Boons were very, very famous for kind of trumpeting and marketing their swan-like ancestry. So when Thomas of Woodstock married into the De Boon family, he took that identity and really, really advertised his swan-like. So his shield has a swan on it, and it's like red and black with a big swan on it. That's Ducally Gorge. And what's really cool is Thomas of Woodstock's descendants are the Dukes of Buckinghamshire. So if you look at the Buckinghamshire county flag, you'll see a Ducally Gorge swan that's red and black background. So that was his image. And then you had John of Gaunt, also was one of his uncles, one of Richard II's uncles, and he had a son called Henry Bolingbroke. And Henry Bolingbroke ended up marrying into the De Boon family as well. And so he also kind of inherited swan-like ancestry as well. And so one of Henry Bolingbroke's symbols was his father. So John of Gaunt had what we call a collar of S's. You'd have to look at a picture or quickly Google it, but it's just like chain linked S's and then kind of hanging down in a pendant. So that was his dad. So his dad gave him his chain pendant, but to make it his, Henry Bolingbroke added a swan pendant to it. So that's how we know that it's Henry's. So Richard II was governed by his uncles and to some extent his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, and he basically didn't like it. So you have all these kind of like, who gets to control Richard? Is it his uncles? Is it the people that he chooses, his advisors? And it ended up getting really messy. So you had something called the Lord's Appelot, where they basically, the uncles and their allies ended up kind of being like, hey, I don't like this ring of power around you. And so they ended up fighting each other and taking away Richard's closest advisors and the people that he really enjoyed. And at first it looked like Richard didn't mind too much. But 10 years later, he ended up imprisoning Thomas Woodstock, so his uncle, and then he ended up getting murdered in the castle. And that was like a big thing. So you have people at the time writing about what a shock it is that Woodstock, he's also the Duke of Gloucester, so sometimes he's referred to as Gloucester, but it's a big thing that Gloucester, Thomas of Woodstock, was imprisoned and murdered. The other thing that Richard did that was really shocking and not cool was when John of Gaunt died, Richard II basically seized all of his assets. So instead of kind of following primogeniture and it being gifted or descended to his eldest son, which was Henry Bolingbroke, because he and Henry didn't really get on, he took all the funds so that Henry wouldn't have it. And the English upper class just really thought that that was really, really poor. So it's those two things. It was murdering his uncle and also seizing John of Gaunt's lands, which are two of the big things that led up to Richard II being dethroned and Henry IV coming to the throne. But the symbols for Henry Bolingbroke and for Thomas of Woodstock were swans. And at the time in Henry's reign, all of a sudden these things called badges get populated around. And when I first was reading about a badge, I was like, what on earth is a badge? And there's some examples in the British Library. I do have an example in the book, but they were basically like pins that you could wear on your shirt, your sleeve, your tunic. And it basically just said, hey, I endorse this guy. So in a slightly contentious example, it's kind of like saying "Make America Great Again." You know who you're siding with if you were to have that on you. And these badges ended up being like, they kind of almost were like little gangs or small armies of the person. And they were really important in the Lord's Appellant when they were kind of contesting Richard II physically in a battle of arms. And these badges were so important that Richard II made laws. So he and the House of Commons were like, please, can we not have badges? And the House of Lords were like, no, badges are great. We're definitely using badges. So he legislates against the use of badges during his lifetime, knowing that they're really difficult. And what Richard II also does during his reign is he comes up with his own badge and he begins disseminating it. Now, many of you may know, or maybe you don't, but Richard's badge, the one that he did, is this beautiful albino or white, we call it white hart, but it's a white deer. Lovely, very beautiful, but it also, it's what we call duplicate gorged. It has that chain around its neck. So one of the things that I argue is because I know that badges were a problem in Richard's reign. I also know that John of Gaunt and his son Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Woodstock were problems in Richard's reign. I also knew that Richard has publicized his own badge, which is a white hart. And so one of the things that I argue is that it's possible that there are several badges that we have extant, that we have surviving. There are these beautiful porcelain white swans that are small and they're very, very, their eyes are made of rubies. They're beautiful, but they are duplicately gorged, made of gold, but they're very tiny, maybe like an inch or two high, but those were also thought to be really beautiful badges. So we have the idea that there were white swans, duplicately gorged, that were disseminating around this time that were badges. So whose could those white swans be? And so I've just made the connection that I think it was likely disseminated by Woodstock and disseminated by John of Gaunt's son Henry Bolingbroke. And in my book, I have two images side by side of a duplicately gorged white swan, which is just so pretty, next to Richard II's white hart that's also duplicately gorged. And they're both white. They both have these really long necks and they both have these golden chains around them. And so that's one of my small arguments, is that I think that these were meant to be foils of each other and it was meant to kind of show off opposing sides.
It's one of those things I think that is so hard to, it's kind of ephemeral, right? Even though these are physical objects, it's a type of thing that we don't necessarily imagine when we think back to the past. Like, we don't imagine people are walking around perhaps with a badge until we come across these physical objects. I think it just goes to show how much we are missing out. If we had a time machine, we would see so many extra things that we are kind of just piecing together, right?
Yeah. The kind of ending to that little story of, and it works so well. I love the idea of a time machine and going back and these pieces of materiality kind of all knitting together. Of course, Henry Bolingbroke ends up becoming Henry IV. And one of Henry IV's amazing heraldic badges are swans. So you get them in manuscripts of like, this is Henry IV, this is his swan. And then he gives them to Henry V. And so Henry V has them much more in his reign. They're part of his coronation feast. They're around his tomb. Swans end up becoming a part of the Kings of Lancaster. So, or that line. So.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting. You mentioned briefly in the book that a swan is the symbol of Henry VI, right? So the son of Henry V, who we're talking about now. And then it's also the sign of Richard Neville, the kingmaker, Warwick, the kingmaker, right? Who is against Henry, and then he's with Henry. And so following the swans around can be confusing. You want to make sure that you're following the right one, right?
Exactly. And I think for who you're talking about, I think he gets his swanly ancestry from a different line, possibly from the De Boons as well. But it's just really interesting because you can claim it, right? And if you claim it and make it appropriate and make it yours. But it's so interesting that you have them kind of opposing. You have these symbols that mutate over time. So I hadn't really thought about it in that way before. But it might, there might be more resonance too.
It just kind of goes to show how popular it was to adopt a swan, because it made you look like you were a very legit line. And I think something we haven't mentioned yet when we're talking about Godfrey de Bouillon stuff is that he was one of the 9 worthies, right? So he's up there with Charlemagne and Arthur. So he's that important. That's why people want to make sure that they're affiliated with him, right?
Yeah. The 9 worthies are, I've described it elsewhere, it's kind of like the Avengers. Like, it's like super like the coolest of the cool of the time. So you have like 3 classical characters, 3 biblical characters, and then kind of what I would call modern characters. And the modern characters are King Arthur, Charlemagne, and Godfrey of Bouillon. And the 9 worthies are etched on, it's not a cathedral in Cologne, but it's like an old town hall, but like all 9 of them are this amazing over the arch. And so to have a 9 worthy as your ancestry is really cool. Like, he was a big deal. So, and I found one of the hard things is he's not, based in my kind of little circle of medieval literature, he's not a big deal. And in cultural memory, he's not a big deal. I hadn't really heard about him before. So I even think it had a maybe stronger resonance on the continent in France and Germany. So it's really interesting, the cultural memory of the Swan Night and how it's been appropriated over time.
Well, while we're in Germany, while we're talking about Cologne in Germany, let's talk about Lohengrin for a second. I hope I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
This has a huge cultural impact, I think, especially through Wagner. So can you tell us a little bit about who Lohengrin is and how that works into our culture today?
Yes. And so to answer that question, I'll dial back just a little bit. So I told you the story of Dolopathos, which was one of the stories of the Swan Night. That kind of was more the French tradition of kind of septuplets being born. But there's another really strong tradition of the Swan Night as this kind of mysterious knight who just shows up, accomplishes really amazing acts. Often it's kind of like justice or like the people who are defenseless themselves. So it's kind of like God's agent, like weirdly arriving and then weirdly leaving. And this really took hold in medieval, if I'm allowed to use this term, medieval German imagination. You have stories that are written in Middle High German about a guy named Lohengrin. Now, Lohengrin first appears in Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, and Parzival is the kind of Middle High German great contribution to Arthurian narrative. And you have at the very, very end of the saga, you have the Swan Knight appearing, and he's the son of Percival or Parzival, German. And so all of a sudden you have Wolfram von Eschenbach kind of merging two traditions at the very end. So you have this really huge, long Arthurian tradition that he covers kind of pretty amazingly. And then at the very end, it's almost like he segues onto this new tradition of the Swan Night. So I have wondered if he wanted to write like a continuation using that as the starting point. But this was rehearsed in cultural memory. And so we have a couple other texts, one called Danièle and one called Lohengrin in Middle High German. And in this text, the Swan Knight resides in the Grail Castle, and riding on the Grail tells Lohengrin that he has to go help Elsa of Brabant. And so he goes, but what should he ride? But a swan pulls him in the boat, but the swan isn't a brother in this tradition. It's an angel sent by God kind of to divinely appoint him and pull him across to where he's meant to be. So he defends Elsa from her persecutors and he ends up marrying her, but he says, right, I'll marry you, but on one condition, and you can't ask me where I'm from. And what's so interesting, and often this motif gets rehearsed over and over again throughout medieval literature, but in this text, this is the only one I found where the knight intended to tell his wife where he was from, but it just had to be on his terms. Often it's kind of, again, it's like, no, you don't ask. But he did intend to tell, but gave birth to a child and was just so upset, about where he was, where are you from? She asked him. And so because of that, he has to return back. So he goes back and leaves and goes back to the Grail Castle. So that's the medieval High German version of this. Now, Wagner found this edition when he was writing, and I think he liked the bones of the structure. He really liked the story, but he goes, it was quite bastardized. It wasn't a very good story. I rescued it. So that's a very, what we call like a Victorian, Victorian attitude towards the Middle Ages. So Wagner basically took it and rewrote it, and the swan ended up not being an angel, but ended up being Elsa's brother, transformed by a witch. And you have his disenchantment happening at the very end, kind of reuniting. But the Swan Knight still has to leave and depart. So it's he takes it, but he makes it different. But of course, Wagner is so popularized, so iconic. So Wagner's Lohengrin produced some amazing things. So one of my favorite things is the pre-Raphaelite imagery around the Swan Night. So we have some paintings of a Swan Night by Walter Crane that were basically directly inspired by listening to Lohengrin, right? And it's very pretty. I love that. I wish I could have included that in the book, but it's in private collection. But the other thing that the opera Lohengrin produced was one of the most famous and iconic castles in the world. And it was Neuschwanstein, so what we call the Disney castle today in Germany. So basically the king at the time just loved Wagner and they were friends. He wanted him to come and live with him in the castle. But he says that as he was building it, part of it was inspired by Lohengrin. So the idea that he has kind of chambers, he has swan rooms. So the swan motif is running throughout Neuschwanstein. So you have at least one room that is kind of covered on I don't know, 4 sides probably, but you have mural after mural of pictures from Wagner's Lohengrin. And then you have it as a leitmotif throughout the palace. You have it on chandeliers, you have it on bed covers, you have it on tablecloths, you have it etched on glass. Everywhere you look, there's one. So it's amazing that this small story from the Middle Ages has become so huge in cultural memory, not only for Neuschwanstein's kind of cultural importance as a really beautiful castle, but we all probably know it today through something more common, through Disney. So Disney took the logo of Neuschwanstein and made it Cinderella's castle, and then Cinderella's castle ended up becoming the logo of Disney. So we have kind of swans very popularized. So leading into something very popular in popular memory.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I was reading your book, I was like, Lohengrin, I know I've heard this before, but I don't think I've listened to the whole thing. Where do I know it from? So I looked it up, and it's the bridal chorus that Here Comes the Bride comes from Lohengrin, which I didn't know. So there's another like medieval throwback for people who are getting married. That bridal chorus comes from Wagner's interpretation of the Swan Night. I was like, oh my gosh, it's everywhere.
Yeah. It's so huge. And I think Bugs Bunny, I think, would do some Wagner like that.
That's right. Yeah.
I feel like it. So if you're like an 80s child, you know, and you grew up on Bugs Bunny, you might recognize Wagner from
That's
the
right.
bits that he used to sing.
Yeah, the Flight of the Valkyries, right? That's the I heard one time that is the song that makes people drive the fastest is listening to the Flight of the Valkyries. I might have that wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's something that I heard once back in the day. Okay,
that's
so
really cool.
One more thing I wanted to get to is that people ate swans. We should probably not forget that. So people ate swans, and that means that they farmed them. So in our last few minutes together, can you tell us a little bit about farming swans?
Sure. So I don't know if you've ever seen a swan, maybe you have, but like they're big birds. Their wingspan is something like 6 feet long, and like my husband tells the story of him watching a swan and a terrier get into a fight, and like the terrier, I don't think, won. So they're really big, powerful, strong birds that have the capacity to fly. So often when you have such a big bird, they can't fly. So pretty amazing. So one of the questions in the Middle Ages is like, right, well, these are obviously big birds. It's a good thing to eat them if you can get them. So how do you keep them? So you could keep swans in several different ways. You could pinion their feathers and just kind of keep them semi-domesticated around your small holding. But more often than not, you would have like common area of grazing and then common rivers. And swans are, of course, waterfowl. So you often would let your swans go, and then they would probably mate with somebody else's swan. So when you would find your swan, how could you recognize your swan? And B, if a swan has like 3 cygnets, who gets what? Do I get all of them because I have the male? Do you get all of them because you have the female? Like how does that work? So because it was on semi-common ground or semi-public ground, all of a sudden legislation for swans became really important. So one of the ways they did that is they began to mark swans on their beaks. And I thought that was just so cool. So you have like anybody who was anybody in medieval England had the right to mark swans, and it was really cool. Like you have like bishops having them, and they would have like a bishop's staff. And one guy, William Bowes, had a mark that was 2 bows. So like sometimes it was like reflective of your name, so you could know who it was. So that's one way you farm swans, was kind of keeping them on semi-common ground. You also had moats. So this was probably less common, but you do have an example of what they call hospital in Norwich, and that was kind of built in deep, so the swans really couldn't get out, and it would have been difficult for them to fly out, or they would have been pinioned, so they couldn't get out. But they were like in water, and they would be living there, and then we needed to eat them, we would kind of grab them. What you have very often in medieval accounts is you have like lots of boroughs around big cities, and when the king wanted to have a feast, he would kind of levy his swan tax and be like, I need each county to give me 3 of your swans. And of course, they're really expensive. They were one of the most expensive items continually. So it was a hefty thing to have to give up your swans as a tax to the king. Being at Durham, I looked through Durham Priory manorial accounts, and it talks about feeding the swans and keeping the records of the swans. You know, where do they come from? Where like how many do we have at year end? How many died? Did they die through sickness? Did they die through death? Did they die through being eaten at like St. Cuthbert's feast? But one of the amazing things about the Middle Ages is like when royalty threw a party, they threw a party. There are cases where you have something like 150 swans like coming out for a dinner. And one of the accounts I found had a recipe for building a giant pastry castle that was so heavy it had to be carried by 6 different people. And then at the base of each castle, they had different animals breathing fire. And one of those creatures is a swan. So they were kind of in pageant displays. They were used in decoration, but they were also cooked and eaten. And there's lots of different ways you could cook a swan. So how to dye a swan is how you call it in the medieval text. And I list several recipes. So like the French had a different way from eating them than the English. They were different, like it's served in different courses and with different things. They used parts of the bird that we wouldn't think to use. So they would kind of boil the swan's intestines and the feet, while we'd be like, okay, that's not available at temperature. Like that's just it's things that we wouldn't normally use, like considered for some of the best bits. So that took me a while to get my head around. But one of the most unusual things they did with a swan is they're kind of showing off, is they called it to redress a swan. And that was through vegetarians close your ears. They would take they would take the skin of the swan and try and keep that as intact as possible. So they take a straw between the skin and the flesh and like blow it out to separate it. And then they take the meat of the bird out and then they roast it over the fire. And then they take it and then they'd stuff it back in the swan's feathers. And then they kind of prop up its neck and out places. And then they like present it beautifully outstretched. So it was quite a showpiece. Not only could it be eaten, but it was kind of a statement of this is dinner and we are having, you know, look at how powerful I am with my beautiful swans that I can eat. So yeah, but royalty often ate swans, and so this kind of led to contention later. So if a swan is worth so much money, and if they're on semi-public ground, I could probably nick a swan and I can make a lot of money, or I could feed my family. So there are so many accounts of people nicking swans, and this is a little bit later. The last part of the book extends into the early modern era, but Queen Elizabeth was very upset. Queen Elizabeth, she goes, where are all my swans? You know, what happened to them? So they even started putting up something called swan moats, and swan moats were swan courts, so that they can have courts over who had stolen these swans and investigate where they got. So it just attests to just how valuable they were as a dinner item and a showpiece, and how the royalty really, at least in England, very much protected their right to own them and to eat them.
Which begs the question now, who owns the swans in England?
So when I was writing the book, the answer was Queen Elizabeth II, but that's no longer true. So it's to King Charles now, technically owns all the swans. Queen Elizabeth only exercised her right on a very tiny part of the Thames, so it's from like Abingdon to the palace. So they would do something called swan upping every year, where they would kind of pull up the swans, see who the mom and dad were, mark the markings down in a book, and then divide the offspring and say, okay, you get one, you get the next one. And they were recording, you know, with the marks who got the next one. So that's no longer done by the kings anymore. But what they do is they use it as an environmental factor in England now. So they take the swans and they assess them for health. They record the number of sickness. They see how they're doing. Kind of in the early before 2000, often lead fishing weights were used with fishing, and if a swan ate that, it would kill it because it's lead poisoning, it would die. So it's a conservation method of kind of outlawing things that would harm the swans. And now, under Queen Elizabeth II first reign, if you were caught swan thieving, it could be years imprisonment. Like if you think about, oh my gosh, like what could I do to get a year's imprisonment? Like that's a long time. Now you're still not allowed to touch swans or to eat swans, not necessarily because the monarchy own them, but because they're now protected under the Natural Wildlife Conservation Act. So many died. They're a restricted species now in Britain, so it's a felony to harm one. So they're still protected, not so much now due to their royal status. But it's very rare to have anyone else in England who owns swans, but there are kind of two other people who own swans, and they also are kind of prestigious. It's the Vintners Company, which is the company of winemakers, and then the Dyers Company, so the company who dye clothes. And these are kind of old medieval guilds, and they have preserved their right to own swans over the years. So they accompany the king's men on the boats, and they kind of give their representatives for swan health, and they assess them, and then they mark their swans. They don't do it on the beak anymore. They now just put a little ringlet on their ankle. So that's worth mentioning. Medieval traditions being still performed now.
It's so interesting to see that kind of tradition continuing, and now how it's changed to be about conservation, because now people can eat turkeys because the Americas have been discovered by Europeans, and now turkeys are what people eat.
Exactly. So one person argued that basically it was the turkey that ousted the swan as the dinner bird.
And yet nobody has a turkey as their sigil.
Yeah. Wow, I think Ben Franklin, didn't he want to have a turkey as the national bird or something like that? I think the eagle is much more prestigious, but...
Yeah, I realized as I said that, I'm like, no, someone probably does have a turkey, but it doesn't seem as majestic.
No, it's definitely not as majestic. So there's something, I don't know if it's just because there's this long cultural memory about it, but there's something very majestic when you look at a swan. You just think, oh, wow, you don't get that, or I don't get that when I look at a turkey.
Yeah, maybe that's just because, you know, we are both North Americans, and that's why.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and telling us about swans, because until I read this book, I didn't realize just how rich the history of swans was, especially in medieval Europe. So thank you so much for introducing us to the medieval swan.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real joy.
To find out more about Natalie's work, you can visit her faculty webpage at durham.ac.uk/staff/n-m-Goodison. Her new book is Introducing the Medieval Swan. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. Well, I've got a story about how you could be a prostitute in medieval Valencia and you could be a concubine in medieval Valencia, but you couldn't be both.
Okay.
So the last few months, we've been working with Speculum, the Journal of Medieval Studies, one of the bigger ones, and reporting on the articles they're coming out with, right? And this one just came out. It's from Susan McDonough and Michelle Armstrong-Partidit. And what they did was look at about 35 years of judicial records from Valencia, like late 14th, early 15th century. And they found about 700 cases, both men and women, that are getting fined for kind of living together while she's also being a prostitute. So this is kind of a fascinating piece. Like, well, why is this? Because prostitution was legalized. They had brothels. It was very heavily regulated. And being a concubine, was kind of allowed and practiced, especially among the upper classes. You had to have that mistress you were living with, right? Mm-hmm. But for the poorer classes, this is something they didn't want to have. So I thought they did a very good look at why is the city authorities and the elite trying to stop them? And then, why are these couples wanting to live together, often for short periods of time, but some for like many years, and are willing to risk large fines and other kind of punishments. So I thought that was a really interesting article. So we took a look at that.
Awesome.
So we've got that. Plus, we have a piece on how the city of Great Zimbabwe, so like the largest medieval city in southern Africa, had this really ingenious water system, just the way land is really prone to droughts. So they had to figure out ways of holding on to water for months at a time. And they had to figure out really kind of ingenious ways of doing that. Plus, we also have the most Instagrammable castles in the world.
Well, I love water systems, so I'm going to have to check that one out for sure. And I mean, who doesn't love castles, right?
I love going on Instagram, but mostly for kittens.
To each his own. Yeah, there's lots of puppy content on my Instagram right now, not kittens. But
indeed.
I would like for there to be more castles. Maybe this summer there'll be more castles on my Instagram. Well, thanks so much, Peter, for letting us know what's on medievalist.net.
Thanks.
Thank you, as always, to all of medievalist.net's patrons on Patreon, whose generosity helps to support this podcast and the work of other indie writers and podcasters on their website. Patrons can access all sorts of goodies like subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, as well as ad-free versions of this podcast. To become one of these superstars yourself, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from swans to Khans, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, on social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a fantastic day.